Well, hi everyone. We're here for part three of Traced and looking at human DNA's big surprise. And following on from last week, where we talked about the history of Western Europeans, fascinating research that Dr. Jensen has done based on the Y chromosome and a biblical time frame of history. It all comes together, and wow, now we can understand a lot more about civilizations and how various cultures came about and their history, and tracing them back to the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Now, today, well, first of all, I'm going to ask Dr. Jensen to define a term, prehistory, because I would say there's no such thing as prehistoric, because history began from when it was recorded in Genesis 1:1. But prehistory in regard to civilizations can be used in a particular way that he's going to define here in a moment, and talk about the history of Native Americans. That's going to be very, very interesting. And to show you that, again, using the Y chromosome research, he's able to find out some fascinating things about the history of Native Americans. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Jensen. I'll come back at the end and sum up here. And then he's going to show some slides. And this is part three. Then we have part four, part five over the next 2 weeks. Dr. Jensen.
I'll pause that prehistory for a moment just to anchor us here real fast on where we've come from and where we're going. And I'm going to reach back again several years to October 2017 when my first book came out, Replacing Darwin, where we advanced the idea that creationists, that we're reaching a new era in the creation evolution debate. Creationists are not just playing defense. They're not just rebutting Darwin. They're replacing ideas with something better, advancing science, advancing our knowledge about the world. And now we've reached another milestone. Creationists are making major scientific discoveries using the biblical timescale, the biblical framework, to start investigating some major questions about human origins and human history. And I'll talk about what this prehistory idea refers to, how it relates and fits in this framework. We've talked about some of the biblical echo, or the genetic echo of biblical events in the last couple episodes, seeing the echo of Noah. We referred briefly to the echo of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and chapter 13 of the book is a really explosive one to be able to read off generation by generation, man by man, down Shem's line through Peleg and his brother Joktan and these other relatives in Genesis 10. It's really remarkable to see how this pops out of the Y chromosome tree and has implications then for all of us being able to trace our ancestry back to specific men in Genesis 10. Every people group can trace their ancestry back to specific men in Genesis 10. And this reveals for us then the story of peoples, something I never learned in school. Well, how does the term prehistory relate to all this? And unfortunately, it is a multi-use term. The evolutionists have used it to refer to the long period of time so technically, before written records is what they'd say prehistory means. And in an evolutionary framework, the millions of years of Earth history would all be prehistoric in their timeline. And of course, that's not true biblically. We have recorded history from the beginning. We have the days of creation in Genesis 1. We have Adam, the first man, Eve, the first woman. All that is written down for us. There's no prehistory within a biblical worldview. The term, unfortunately, is also used for a much narrower sense within the context of the history of civilization. You can have a lack of written records in specific regions of the globe post-Babel. So, for example, the Bible tells us after the flood, Noah and his family exited the ark. They began to multiply. God told them and their descendants to spread out. They disobeyed. God forced them to spread out by confusing their languages. And then, biblically, for many of these peoples, ethno-linguistic groups, the record goes dark. And extra biblically, the record does as well, either because, again, thinking of the Native Americans, either because they didn't write down where they went and what they were doing and what happened after they got there, or in some cases, the records may have been lost. I think the Aztecs destroyed some of the records of the peoples before them, and that's not uncommon. If I'm not mistaken, the first unified Chinese dynasty, the Qin dynasty in the 200s BC, destroyed records before them. It's a way of trying to establish your dominance and say, we are the true people and this is our history. And it's a sad state of affairs, but that's what leads to then these blank spots or these dark windows into the past where we wish we knew what was going on, but the records either weren't written down or they were destroyed or perhaps they've been lost. Growing up, I learned next to nothing about the history of the Americas before Columbus. I learned about the tribes that were encountered as Europeans pushed westward. But in terms of what happened before then, before Columbus, it was a big mystery to me. And I've learned since then, even before getting into this Y chromosome research, that one of the reasons we learn so little about it is because all this is changing dramatically, even within a mainstream view. There's a lot of old stereotypes that are being rewritten. One of the common ones, just to refer and contrast what I'm about to show you to the evolutionary timescale and the evolutionary narrative, one of the common stereotypes of Native Americans has arisen basically out of an evolutionary mindset. Whether there's a cause-direct effect, that's not what I'm saying. Just if you look at how the evolutionists explain the origin of Native Americans, and then you think about the common stereotypes, those seem to fit together. Evolutionists would say mankind evolved in Africa. Modern Homo sapiens arose in Africa 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, left Africa 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, and then very late in an evolutionary context, 15,000 years ago, the first Americans arrived in the Americas, spread throughout there, and have lived there in isolation, disconnected from the old world for the past 14,500 years, until Columbus, essentially. Some of the common stereotypes about Native Americans were they were these small bands of people living in harmony with nature, and these, to draw on many stereotypes, these big bad Europeans came in and destroyed all this, brought technology, destroyed their native way of life, destroyed the Stone Age technology, and this difference in culture, advanced civilization, Stone Age technology, is part of the reason Native Americans were overrun by Europeans. So many of those stereotypes are now being overturned by the mainstream scientists themselves. They would now say that there were massive numbers of people in the Americas, not small bands, on the eve of Columbus's arrival. They weren't out there hugging the trees, living in harmony with nature. They were transforming their environments. If you saw our 2020 video series, we talked about some of these shocking discoveries in mainstream science about how sections that people would look at and say, oh, this is jungle, this is rainforest, cloud forest, surely it's always been this way. Nope, you dig down in the soil layers and you see the Native Americans use it as farmland just a few hundred years ago, and all that's been overrun by plant life. Crazy stuff that's being changed. All this is changing so fast, it's hard to get it into the history books, which is perhaps one of the reasons why I didn't hear about it growing up. Well, I'm about to change it even more. 15,000 years ago, from a biblical perspective, is far too long. And I go through the book, the reasons why the biblical time scale makes much more sense of what we're about to see. But without giving too much away, let's shift gears now away from the mainstream time scale, away from some of these old stereotypes, and think now about this Rosetta Stone of human history, a DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity. This particular tree, again, you can find it in the book, and zooming in on several subsections of this tree in the book, this is front and center in all of these discussions, chapter by chapter. This is based on DNA from men around the globe, including Native Americans. And the branch or the section of the tree that we want to focus on heavily for the next few minutes is this branch found at high levels in Native Americans, this branch called Q. And again, if you're trying to make sense of why it goes from N to S to Q to R, some of it's a little bit arbitrary. There is a little bit of method to the madness. If it's a deep branch, you get a separate letter of the alphabet. So these branches right here, you'll see it in the book in much more detail. S, K, and M, they're all deep branches. And so they get separate letters of the alphabet. Q is a deeper branch here, but it separates from R, and so it gets a separate letter of the alphabet. As Q subdivides into various branches, you'll get Q1, Q2, and so on. Q1A, Q1B. There's a method to it. It's just not that pretty and can be somewhat overwhelming to see all of it at once. Q is our focus for today. If we look at where Q is found around the globe, we can display it like this. And again, the size of the circles represents the relative abundance of this particular branch among men in these places today. So the bigger the circle, the more abundant the branch. This circle right here represents the Navajo in southwestern United States. The Navajo today, more than 90% of them belong to this branch Q. And you can see up and down the Americas, all these circles are quite large. This is the dominant lineage in the Americas. One thing I should add as a caveat, sadly, if you look at Latin America as a whole, the vast majority of peoples, men, belong to branches that are not native. About 80% belong to branches that are clearly European in origin and due to the recent arrival of Europeans, or they're African in origin due to the ugly practice of the transatlantic slave trade. For these displays, I've removed those from the equation because we want to know the history of the Americas before the European and African arrival. And the one lineage that dominates more than any other is this lineage Q. You'll notice that it's also present here in the Old World. Hardly any levels in Africa, hardly anything in Europe. There's a small circle over here in Iceland. Not really anything to speak of here in Australia. East Asia has very small circles in South Asia. It's really Central Asia up here and Central Russia where you see the bigger circles. This bigger circle is the Selk'uk people. They're almost extinct. There's only a few thousand of them left. And so I think that circle is not necessarily due to them having a long history of Q as much as to them almost going extinct. And then as your population size goes smaller and smaller, certain branches tend to be favored. But if you look at the closest branches on the tree to the Native Americans, they do go back to this area that I'm calling Central Asia. The mainstream community would agree and say, yes, Native Americans arose from Central Asia. Here's one of the main differences, though. They would say Q arrived in the Americas 15,000 years ago. Now, why would they say that? You can look up one of the Y chromosome papers. It's not because they measured something unique in the genetics of Native Americans, where they looked at fathers and sons and measured how fast the Y chromosome changes. No, what they do is they say, well, we know from archaeology that the history of the Americas goes back 15,000 years. And so therefore, we will run our entire tree, we'll stretch it out over hundreds of thousands of years. And if Q lands and originates from Central Asia 15,000 years ago, now we know we're on the right track. They call this literally a sanity check. And I've got the references in the book you can look it up yourself to see how they talk about it. So it's not like Q is this independent check on their research. They already adopt the old Earth, the evolutionary time scale, and almost make sure the data fits this 15,000 years ago origin. Well, what happens if you follow the evidence where it leads? Because there's much evidence that human origin genetically go back only a few thousand years. And there's evidence even within the branches of the Native Americans themselves. And I talk about this in the book. The Native Americans themselves, we know, had a massive population collapse. Lots of people here before Columbus, huge collapse after Columbus. You can see the echo of that in the Y chromosome tree with incredible detail. You can see 1492 and boom, the population disappears. It's a little bit complicated how it works genetically, but I explain it in the book. And there it is. It's the smoking gun of that event. And it's only visible in the way that I show it if you have the biblical timescale. One of the strongest regional arguments for the veracity of the young Earth timescale in this type of analysis. Okay, well, I still haven't told you at what time the Native Americans, or I should say this branch Q, arrives in the Americas. So you run all this analysis, branch Q arrives in the AD 300s to 600s. Not 15,000 years ago, 300s to 600s. Now, we're going to unpack what this means here momentarily. But if you've read anything about Native American history, this might raise an immediate question in your mind. We do have an archaeological record, not 15,000 years ago, but if you just look at the history of civilization, the Americas were a cradle of civilization, and the culture that birthed this cradle of civilization was the Olmecs. The mainstream science community would say the Olmec civilization arose about 1500 BC. Not 15,000, 1500 BCs. So essentially, the evolutionary community says 15,000 years ago, the first Native Americans came across and had no civilization for over 10,000 years. And then finally, late in history, they found the cradle of civilization, the Olmecs. They carved these giant sculpted heads. Look at that gravel and plants for comparison. Huge things. The Mayans, sort of the American equivalent of the Roman civilization, both considered the classic era of civilization. Their civilization began around the 400s BC. Both of those dates, 1500 BC, 400s BC, all of those are centuries, if not a millennium, prior to the arrival of this branch Q in the Americas. And again, those are big circles in the Americas. This is the lineage that dominates the Americas. What happened? At a minimum, what we can say is that this group Q, arriving in the first few centuries after Christ in the Americas from Central Asia, apparently replaced, perhaps conquered, the civilizations that were there prior. If you know anything about Mayan history, you know that the mainstream community talks about the collapse of the Mayan civilization around the 800s to 900s, and no one can explain why. I'm suspicious that this migration event had something to do with it. What's even more exciting to me is the way this new discovery, this new event in so-called prehistory, connects American history back to known history that we all learned in school. So if you took world history, which is probably for many of us a history of Western civilization, you learn about the Roman Empire, you learn about the fall of the Roman Empire. And I've tried to superimpose here on this map in tan the extent of the Roman Empire at its height. You probably learn about the invasion of the Roman Empire from peoples from the East, one of whom was the Huns. Mainstream community still debates who exactly these people came from. If you look at Traced, I've got a good guess as to, I think we've got a good genetic echo of these people and then an indication of who they were. But the date for this is around the 400s AD, and I'm building a narrative here because I want you to see how connected the American history is to old world history that we learn. If you've taken world history that includes Eastern history, Far East and such, you know that the Roman equivalent, so to speak, in the East is the Han Dynasty of China. They reign from about the 200s BC to the 200s AD when they are overthrown by people known as the Xianbai. Even though the mainstream community doesn't exactly know who the Huns came from, they would say the Huns came from Central Asia. Again, this region of the modern stans, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and such. The Xianbai, they would say, are Central Asians in origin. Because these two classic era civilizations fall around the same time, within a few centuries of each other, at the hands of Central Asian peoples, this segment of human history is known in the mainstream community by a German name, the Völkerwanderung, which translated is the Great Wandering of Peoples. The mainstream community will say something was stirring in Central Asia that puts people on the move, and they happen to have great success in conquest, overthrowing these classic era civilizations. Well, lo and behold, genetically, this group Q comes out of Central Asia right around the same time, 300s to 600s AD. I'm just going to call them the Wanderers. They end up in the Americas not long before the Roman equivalent in the Americas, the Mayan civilization undergoes its own collapse. So why did they migrate? I think we've got a good answer based on what we already know about the history of civilization in the old world. This is the type of thing you don't get. You get a big disconnect if you use the evolutionary time scale to try to understand this. So there's the date, and I think we've got an event to explain why this happened. There's something stirring, the mainstream community would say, in Central Asia. Well, now we've got genetics and an appropriate date to anchor one of the settlings of the Americas around that same time. That's not the only event, though, that occurred before Columbus. There is another branch in the Americas that arrived even later than Group Q. This is Group C, haplogroup C. It's found in many spots in the old world. You can see, and I've got a map where it shows it all red, and I've color-coded this to show you the various sub-branches within C. There's pink here for the one that's Siberian and Central Asian. And I talk about in the book how there was an ancient migration from Siberia down through Japan into the Indonesian islands, over to India, eventually down into Australia, the Aborigines, across here, and even reach Easter Island. Group C seems to explain some of this late migration of the Pacific peoples out into the far reaches of the Pacific. The Native American branch, you can see here, there's the, up here in Alaska, all the way down to Ecuador, Peru, such. There is pink present. You can see down here for the Navajos, it's almost invisible. It's so tiny. C is a minority among the Native American lineages. And just for comparison's sake, there's the group Q again. You can see all these circles are much bigger, much more abundant, but C is present at low levels. And the date for its arrival in the Americas is around 1000 AD. Okay, why does that matter? Well, if you were with us a week ago with the last episode, and you're thinking, okay, Central Asia, 1000 AD, what's going on? You might recall that my story, Ken Ham's story, also has a very significant correlation to the Middle Ages. So we talked about mapping out a different branch, R1b, that gives rise to much of Western Europe. In the early Middle Ages, it's out here in Central Asia. And in the middle and later Middle Ages, you can see R1b starts migrating from Central Asia. It starts showing up here in Eastern Europe, similar time, Eastern Europe. And then late in history, it migrates out of the Balkans into Central Asia, late 1400s, early 1500s. There it is, a Central Asian branch, a Central European branch, French, Spanish, Portuguese branch heavily there, sort of a Central Southern European branch, and then something moving towards the islands, Ireland and the British Isles and such. Again, if you map all this out, you have the origin of a migration from Central Asia into Europe beginning around 1000 AD. Now, why do I say that? Again, this path that seems to follow the geography of Europe, and again, you can find this map in the book Trace. This seems to mirror exactly what we already knew about the migrations of Central Asians into Europe. It just so happens that these peoples, the Magyars and some of these Turkic peoples like the Pechenegs, Oghuz, Kipchaks, new names to me until I had to do this research, but found out this is all already well known in mainstream history. These migrations happen, and you can see these dates in the book as well, 700s, 1000s, 700s, 800s. Right around the same time that Group C is migrating into the Americas, from Central Asia into the Americas, a whole bunch of Central Asians are also migrating into Europe. Something apparently is stirring again. And in Europe, they end up dominating the lineages today. So once again, we've got a historical event in the old world, migrations into Europe, well documented, that seems to also explain another migration into the Americas. And let me add one more historical detail from the Native Americans themselves. If we look at Native American languages, you can group them into language families. Now, I have a feeling these groupings will eventually change with time. But I want to make a point from the existing classification. If you're in the United States, you've probably heard of the Navajo and the Apache, who are currently, their reservations are down here in southwestern United States. Their languages belong to a family known as Athabascan. And you can see on this map here, the major geographic region for Athabascan languages is up here in Alaska, northwest Canada. Why does that matter? Well, there were peoples in the southwestern United States before the Apaches and the Navajos, the Pueblo peoples. The Pueblo peoples themselves say that the Navajos and Apaches, who linguistically are connected to the north, arrived in the southwest late in history, only a few centuries before the Spaniards came up from the south. So you've got Spaniards in the 1500s. The Pueblo people say these Navajos and Apaches arrived maybe about the 1200s, which is just, again, a few centuries after AD 1000. So I'm suspicious that this migration of haplogroup C, branch C, may have something to do with the movements of these Athabascan peoples. If nothing else, it happens at the same time that Central Asians move the opposite direction, not into the Americas, but into Europe, and end up dominating, giving rise to people like Ken and myself and other many people of Western European descent today. That's fascinating to me. So just to stop and reflect, we've got not one settling of the Americas so far, but at least two, haplogroup C, group C in the 81,000, and Q in the 300s to 600s, which is very different from anything you learn right now in mainstream history. No one talks about this. You walk away thinking it was a rather passive time period, not much going on, isolation from the old world for thousands of years, and this overthrows that completely and connects it, again, very firmly to the old world history that we learn in school. Now, I just want to work backwards in time real fast to see if we can put together a full narrative of the history of the Americas before Columbus. So working backwards in time from the most recent settling to the most ancient. The more recent one, pre-arrival of Europeans, is this Group C from Central Asia in 81,000. Before that, you have Group Q arriving in the 300s to 600s. Apparently, again, dominating everyone else that was there prior. What about the Mayans? Their beginnings are the 400s BC. We've got a general geographic origin for these other peoples. It's sort of Central, maybe East Asia. If you look at East Asia, this is a map from 350 BC, not the 400s, but it's close in time, representative. The 700s to about 200s BC in East Asia are one of the most tumultuous eras of East Asian history. In the Warring States period, I think it's estimated, I've got these statistics in the book, 1.3 wars every year. It's called Warring States because there's just constant fighting. At the end of this period, there are a number of wider Far Eastern peoples who trace their origins here. The Vietnamese say, we came from one of these kingdoms. The Koreans would say, we came from somewhere up here. And the Japanese and the Koreans seem to have a connected history. So if this is the time period for the Mayan origins, is it too much of a stretch to say perhaps one of these kingdoms, when the fighting finally settled down, ended up going up north and east and ending up in the Americas? There's a lot more we could say about this. I have a good candidate for a good guess as to which particular haplogroup might have given rise to the ancient Mayan peoples. But the bottom line is, and this is the point I make in the book, no one yet knows what the ancient Mayan lineage is. And just to stop and reflect for a moment, again, something I mentioned in previous episodes, the evolutionists have demanded from creationists testable predictions. Tell us something that we can test with experiments in the future. Well, this is a research project that is ongoing that we're hoping to discover. This is full-fledged science marching onwards, trying to make new discoveries about the world. We're in discussions right now about perhaps finding some Guatemalan volunteers to see if they might have in their DNA still the lineage of the ancient Mayans. There's Mayan speakers to this day in Guatemala, also the Yucatan Peninsula. I have a feeling if we find the Mayan lineage, it'll be one of those that already exists in East Asia, obviously going back to an ancient time. But this is an unsolved mystery that future experiments based in creation science could eventually uncover. The same story applies to the Olmecs. I'll just go through this quickly. They're a cradle of civilization. I've got this map in the book as well, along with the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Minoans. They're considered a cradle. We also do not have their lineage. They may be extinct. I mean, they're eventually supplanted, I think, by the Mayans. And of course, they collapse and they're supplanted by others. So if it exists, I have a feeling it's a lineage that's yet undiscovered. If it does exist, it's in the DNA of perhaps one of the people watching this right now. So you yourself might be able to contribute to future research. Again, if you go to our website, ancestorsingenesis.org, type in /go/traced, you can find our Hidden History of Every People project. Click on that. It'll take you to a place where you can enter your name and info and email address. And you yourself might have the answer to these questions that I'm very interested in. I'm sure many people are interested in as well, to fill in the rest of the story of the Americas before Columbus, the rest of the post-Babel history in the Americas. So this category of so-called prehistory is another major volume that this creation-based research contributes to our understanding of our past, of our history. This is basically chapter 12 or so of this book that talks about this in great detail. And just to reiterate again, this research follows on from research I laid out in this book, Replacing Darwin. You don't have to have read this to understand Traced, but do know that there are predictions made in Traced that are fulfilled. Predictions made in Replacing Darwin that are fulfilled and Traced. And this is a major answer, a major rebuttal to a long-standing creationist objection. I'll tell you more about that in subsequent episodes, but there is an organic link between these two. This is the simple version of that. Again, if you have questions that we're not able to answer here or in the book, you can connect with me on social media as well. Or like I mentioned, there is research ongoing right now. I've got connections, been able to make some connections internationally to understand the rest of the history of people on Earth.
Well, Dr. Jensen, that is absolutely fascinating. I was just thinking, do you think politicians would really like this history? You know, when you think of some of the things they've already said about the history of the Americas, I'm sure some politicians just, they probably don't want to hear this.
I'd say it probably depends on where they are. The mainstream narrative here, this is highly politically incorrect right now in the United States. However, from some of my Latin American contacts, they said, if you tell the political leaders of Guatemala, we want to find your lineage, you are the earliest people, that would sing. So it probably depends on where you go in the world. Yep. Those who find out later in history might get all mad. Those who find out you're the earliest history are happy. One of the things that I feel like has great social potential, there are many groups around the globe. Think of India. There are the I forget their Hindi name, but they're lower class, even lower caste, I think, people in the forest peoples. viewed lower in society. They may have the lineages within them of the earliest Indian people, of the Indus River Valley civilization. So if you can make discoveries like this, in a sense, it returns dignity to them in a way that the culture currently suppresses. And that aspect of this research to me is one of the most satisfying, to be able to give back to people history that they've lost, or that others who are in power are trying to suppress and take away from them. And again, grounded in the scriptural narrative, grounded takes you right back to Babel. All this to me is very, very exciting.
It's just a reminder, had people believed God's word and believed the history that he's already revealed to us concerning people, it would have changed a lot of things. And of course, that's a great lead up for next week as we do part 4 of Traced. And next week, you're going to talk about race and ethnicities and some shocking in quotes, discoveries. It's interesting, in the year 2000, the Human Genome Project mapped the human genome, and they came out with a statement, and they said, you know what we found? There's only one race. Well, of course, had you already believed the Bible, you would know that there's only one race. Of course, a lot of politicians don't want to know that either, because they want to create division. And, the bottom line is people are in rebellion against God. That's our sin nature. So a lot of people don't want to know this history. But you're doing something here that is absolutely cutting edge, and you're taking the biblical time frame, but now you're showing how it makes sense of what we're discovering in science in regard to the Y chromosome and the differences and similarities and the correlation of that with people groups around the world. And we go back and find some interesting things. So we look forward to next week, to part 4, where you reveal some of those shocking discoveries. So join us next week, same time, for part 4 of Traced.